No. Just no. This is beyond repair. I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do.
The old man's knees ached as he pressed them into the soft earth, his weathered gloves dark with the morning moisture as he worked the soil between the tomato stakes. It was just past 7 in the morning, the kind of quiet hour that belongs only to gardeners and soldiers, men who have learned that the world rewards those who rise before it does. His name was Earl Mackenzie, 74 years old, stooped at the shoulders, moving slow but deliberate, the way a man moves when he has stopped rushing and started meaning. He had been tending this same quarter-acre garden behind his modest ranch house in Millbrook, Virginia, for going on 19 years. The neighbours who passed on the sidewalk out front rarely gave him a second glance. Just old Earl, puttering around again. If you've ever watched someone get dismissed simply because of their age, their clothes, their quiet manner, comment the word respect below. Because what happened to Earl Mackenzie in the summer of last year is a story that will change the way you look at every older person you pass on the street. Earl had been working the far corner of the garden that Tuesday morning, the spot where the clay soil ran harder and deeper, where his turnips always came in undersized no matter what he did to the ground. He drove his narrow spade in at an angle, felt it hit something that wasn't rock, something that rang faintly, like a bell muffled by decades of earth. He stopped, tilted his head the way old soldiers tilt their heads when something doesn't fit the expected pattern. He dug again, slower, more deliberate. The shape began to emerge from the clay like a revelation, long and dark and encrusted with decades of rust and compacted soil. He crouched lower, set the spade aside and used his gloved fingers to clear the remaining dirt. And then he saw it. A rifle. Military issue by the look of the receiver. The wood stock was cracked but intact, preserved in part by the density of the clay around it. The barrel was pitted with surface rust but not, and this was the thing that made Earl's breath slow, not corroded through. He sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long moment before he touched it again. 19 years in this garden, and the ground had been holding a secret the whole time. Earl had spent 22 years in the United States Army. He had handled more rifles than most men had held books. He knew the feel of military steel the way a musician knows the grain of a particular wood intuitively before the conscious mind catches up. He turned the rifle over in his hands and began reading it the way you read a letter from someone you used to know very well. The receiver markings were partially obscured by rust and earth, but the design, the profile of the action, the shape of the trigger guard, the geometry of the bolt told him enough. This was not a modern commercial rifle. This was something older, something from a different era entirely, and his hands, even now, even at 74 with their arthritis and their reduced grip strength, recognized it the way you recognize a face from your past, not perfectly, not without effort, but with a certainty that lives below the level of words. He carried it inside carefully, wrapped in an old canvas tarp, and set it on the workbench in his garage. He spent 2 hours just looking at it, consulting the worn reference books he kept on the shelf above the bench. Military arms manuals, historical identification guides, a battered copy of a collector's encyclopedia he had bought at an estate sale 15 years ago. What he found made him set the books down and just sit for a while. The rifle, insofar as he could determine from the visible markings and the mechanical configuration, appeared to be a First World War-era service rifle, possibly brought back by a returning soldier and buried here, on this land, for reasons that had gone to the grave with whoever put it there. It was rare, potentially historically significant, and it was broken. The bolt mechanism fouled, the spring likely compromised, the trigger assembly locked solid with corrosion and decades of compression. Earl knew his own limitations. His eyes were good enough for the reference books, but the fine mechanical work required to properly restore a firearm of this age and complexity, that required steady hands and precision tools he no longer had access to. He had done his own minor gunsmithing for years, field repairs, basic maintenance, the kind of practical mechanical work the army had taught every man to perform on his own weapon. But this was different. This deserved proper attention from someone with the right equipment. He decided to take it to Callaway's, the gun shop on Route 9 that had been there for 30 years, the place most of the serious shooters in Millbrook went when they needed real work done. He called ahead, described what he had in general terms and made an appointment for Thursday morning. He arrived at Callaway's at 9 o'clock Thursday, with the rifle wrapped in the same canvas tarp, carrying it under his arm the way you'd carry something you were treating with care. The shop smelled the way gun shops always smell, oil and metal and the particular dust of a place where mechanical things are the currency of conversation. There was a young man behind the counter, 25, maybe 26. Dark hair, well built, wearing a Callaway's branded polo shirt with the name tag that read, Derek. He was working on something at the bench behind the counter when Earl came in, and he looked up with the expression of someone who has been interrupted but is professionally required to manage it. "Help you?" Derek said. "I called Thursday," Earl said. "Earl Mackenzie, I've got something I'd like you to look at." Derek set down what he was working on and came to the counter. Earl unwrapped the tarp and laid the rifle on the glass case top, and Derek looked at it. Not with the focused attention of a craftsman examining something unfamiliar, with the quick, sweeping glance of someone who has already formed an opinion before the object has finished appearing in front of him. And then he did something that Earl had not expected. He laughed. Not meanly, exactly. More in the way of someone who finds the situation genuinely absurd, who cannot quite believe what has been placed in front of him. A short, dismissive exhale that contained within it an entire verdict. "Where did you find this?" Derek asked, still with that half-smile. "Garden," Earl said. "Dug it up Tuesday morning." Derek picked the rifle up, without asking, without the particular care that the age and condition of the piece warranted, and turned it over with the casual confidence of a young man who has not yet learned that his confidence sometimes outruns his knowledge. He worked the bolt handle, found it frozen solid, rattled it once in a way that made Earl's jaw tighten, and set it back down. "Sir, this thing is a wreck," Derek said. "I mean, look at this bolt. The spring's probably been compressed for 50 years. The barrel's got pitting all down the inside. I bet money on it. And whatever's going on with the trigger assembly, that's not something you're going to fix without parts that don't exist anymore. This is, I'm sorry to tell you this is a wall hanger at best. Museum piece if you're lucky. But as a functional firearm?" He shook his head with the conclusiveness of a man pronouncing a sentence. "Impossible. This is a waste of time to try and restore. You'd spend more money than it's worth, and even then you'd probably fail." Earl looked at the rifle on the counter. He looked at Derek. He said nothing for a moment, in the measured way of a man who has learned that silence is sometimes the most precise response available. "I appreciate you taking a look," Earl said quietly. "Thank you for your time." He wrapped the rifle back in the tarp. He carried it out to his truck. He sat in the parking lot for a few minutes with the engine off, his hands on the wheel, not angry in the explosive way of a younger man, but in the deeper, slower way of someone who has been dismissed and knows it, and has decided what to do about it. He drove home. He went into his garage and he stood in front of his workbench and he looked at the rifle wrapped in canvas on the bench, and something settled in him. A kind of quiet resolution that doesn't announce itself with declarations or emotion, but simply arrives, the way the decision to do something difficult always arrives for a certain kind of man. Not as a feeling, but as a fact. He was going to fix this rifle himself. He was going to do it right. And he was going to do it because he knew something that Derek did not know, which was that the word impossible is most often used by people who have decided not to try. The first day, he did nothing but clean. This is the part that most people skip, the part where patience reveals what is actually there versus what despair has convinced you is there. He worked with penetrating oil, careful applications allowed to dwell for specific intervals, not rushed. He used bronze bristle brushes, softer than steel, to begin addressing the surface rust without removing metal. He worked the exterior of the bolt housing with the methodical attention of a man who is not in a hurry, because he understands that hurry at this stage costs you everything. By the end of the first day, he had made the rifle significantly cleaner and no more functional, and he was satisfied. He covered it, went inside, ate soup, and slept. The second day was about the bolt. The bolt on a rifle of this age, frozen for decades, is not a problem you solve by forcing it. Force tells you nothing and costs you everything. Stripped threads, damaged surfaces, a mechanism that will never seat properly again. Earl knew this the way he knew a great many things, not from reading about it, but from having once learned it the hard way, in a different context a long time ago. He worked the penetrating oil in again, at the junction of every surface he could identify. He applied very gentle, very controlled pressure at specific points, rocking the mechanism in fractions of movement, listening, and this was the thing that separated a man who truly knew mechanical systems from a man who had read about them. He was listening. for the sounds that told him where the resistance lived, where the corrosion had bridged the clearances, where the metal had essentially married itself to metal and would require coaxing rather than force to remember that it had once been designed to move. By late afternoon on the second day, the bolt was moving. Slowly, not fully, not smoothly, but moving. And Earl sat back in his chair and allowed himself a single moment of quiet satisfaction before he got back to work. He sourced the spring through a supplier he had known for years, a retired machinist outside of Roanoke who maintained an inventory of obsolete military firearm parts that would have amazed and humbled most modern gun shop employees. He described what he needed over the phone with the precision of a man who had spent decades speaking the language of mechanical specifications. The part arrived by morning courier on the third day, packaged in a small padded envelope with a handwritten label, the way things used to be sent before everything became automated and impersonal. Earl held it in his palm and checked it against the original dimension with his calipers. It was correct. He allowed himself a small nod. The trigger assembly took 4 hours on the third day. This was the finest work, the most demanding, the part that required the steadiest hands and the sharpest eyes, and Earl Mackenzie was not a young man. His hands gave him trouble. He had to stop twice and wait for the tremor to settle, sitting very still with his hands flat on the bench until the stillness returned. An observer, had there been one, might have found it heartbreaking watching a man of his age at that kind of work, fighting his own body for the precision that a younger version of him would have achieved without thinking. But Earl did not find it heartbreaking. He found it simply the work that needed doing. He continued. He had long since stopped expecting his body to cooperate without negotiation, and he had learned to negotiate with patience and without resentment. By 3 in the afternoon, the trigger assembly was correct. Properly fitted, properly adjusted, the sear engagement precise, the pull weight consistent. He checked it dry 12 times. He checked it again. He took the rifle out to the back of his property, to the small earthen berm he maintained for exactly this kind of testing, and he shot it. 3 rounds, carefully loaded, each one chambered and fired with the controlled attention of a man who has been trained to verify, not assume. The bolt cycled cleanly, the trigger broke crisply, at the correct point in the pull, without creep and without over-travel. The rifle functioned, not as a wall hanger, not as a museum piece, as a firearm, as what it had been built to be. Earl ejected the last case and stood at the berm for a moment in the afternoon quiet, listening to the echo fade across the backfield, and he felt something that he would not have described to anyone as pride, because he was not a man who used that word easily, but that is what it was. He wrapped the rifle in the tarp again. He drove back to Calloway's. He arrived just after 4 with the late afternoon light coming through the front windows of the shop at the angle that makes dust visible in the air. Derek was behind the counter again in the same Calloway's polo, working on what appeared to be the same project as before. He looked up when Earl came in, and his expression went through a sequence of minor adjustments. Recognition, mild surprise, a professional reset into courtesy. "Mr. Mackenzie," Derek said. "Back again?" "I am," Earl said. He set the wrapped rifle on the counter. He unwrapped it. Derek looked at it. He looked at it the way you look at something that is in the wrong place, that is occupying a reality it has no right to occupy, because the rifle on the counter was recognizably the same rifle he had examined 3 days ago. Same profile, same wood, same general configuration, and it was also profoundly, inexplicably different. The surface rust was gone, addressed and treated, the metal showing the warm, dark tone of properly preserved old steel rather than the patchy orange-brown degradation of neglect. The wood stock had been cleaned and lightly treated, the crack stabilized and virtually invisible from arm's length, and the bolt that Derek had rattled with one hand and dismissed as hopelessly seized, was seated perfectly, moving in the receiver with the smooth authority of a mechanism that has been correctly fitted and properly lubricated. "That's..." Derek started. He stopped. "Go ahead," Earl said quietly. Derek reached for the rifle, this time with both hands, this time with the different quality of attention you give to something that has surprised you. He lifted it. He worked the bolt handle and it moved, fully, cleanly, through its complete range of travel and back into battery, with the satisfying solidity of a well-fitted action. His expression changed. It kept changing, cycling through disbelief and then something more complicated. The specific expression of a young professional who was confronting the possibility that he was wrong in a way that cost him something, that the confidence he had expressed 3 days ago was not competence but its convincing imitation. "You did this yourself?" Derek asked. "I did," Earl said. "In 3 days." "In 3 days." Derek set the rifle down on the counter with a care he had not shown it before. He looked at it for a moment and then he looked at Earl. Really looked. Perhaps for the first time. At the worn hands, at the posture that had the particular quality of a man who has been at attention so many times that something of it persists in the way he simply stands, at the quietness, at the patience, at all the things that had been visible 3 days ago and had not registered, because he had looked at an old man in gardening clothes and had decided he was seeing, something small and uncomplicated. "You have a background in this kind of work," Derek said. It was not quite a question. "Army," Earl said. 22 years. Armourer for the last 9 of it. Derek was quiet for a moment. An armourer, a military armourer, a man who had spent nearly a decade as the person professionally responsible for the maintenance, repair and functional integrity of military weapon systems. A man who had, for almost a decade of his professional life, done exactly this: assessed, diagnosed, disassembled, repaired, reassembled, and verified firearms of various ages and conditions as his primary duty. Derek had looked at this man on Thursday morning and seen an obstacle to his lunch break. "I owe you an apology," Derek said. His voice had lost the easy confidence it had carried 3 days ago. It had not been replaced by shame. Exactly. More by the particular sobriety of someone who has learned something at someone else's expense and knows it. "I was dismissive. I didn't. I made assumptions." "You did," Earl said. Not unkindly, not harshly, simply as a statement of what had happened, which deserved to be acknowledged plainly between 2 people. The rifle wasn't impossible to fix. It needed someone who knew what they were looking at and was willing to take the time. "What parts did you use?" Derek asked. And now his tone was different entirely. The tone of someone who wants to learn something, who has recognized the presence of knowledge greater than his own, and has decided to approach it rather than ignore it. Earl told him. He told him about the penetrating oil and the timing of the applications. He told him about the bolt work and the importance of listening to a frozen mechanism rather than forcing it. He told him about the spring supplier outside Roanoke, the retired machinist who kept parts that no commercial shop would bother with. He told him about the trigger assembly and the 4 hours it had taken, and the tremor in his hands that he had waited out twice, and the calipers, and the verification at the berm. He told him all of this without drama, and without any of the edge of a man who is proving a point, because he was past the point of proving points. He was simply a man with knowledge, offering it to someone who was now capable of receiving it. Derek listened. He asked questions, good ones, the kind that tell you a person is actually thinking rather than waiting for their turn to speak. He asked about the spring specification. He asked about the approach to the trigger sear. He asked where you would even begin to look for parts on a rifle of this era and configuration. And Earl answered each question the way a man answers when he knows the answer well, without flourish, without hesitation, directly and completely. There was a man at the back of the shop behind a partially open door that led to the workshop, who had been listening to this conversation for several minutes without announcing himself. His name was Gerald Calloway. 68 years old, the founder and owner of Calloway's, a man who had run this shop for 30 years and who had himself served in the United States Army in the 1970s before a back injury redirected his life towards civilian work. He had heard Earl come in the first time, had not been at the counter, had been doing the books in the back office, but had heard the tone of the exchange, the laugh, the verdict delivered. He had not intervened because Derek was his nephew's son, working here for a summer before a job in another city, and because he had told himself, in the way that older people sometimes tell themselves things they are not entirely convinced of, that Derek was learning, would figure it out, would encounter his own limitations in the natural course of things. He had not thought it would happen quite this fast, or quite this vividly. Gerald came through the door into the front of the shop and he looked at the rifle on the counter, and he looked at Earl Mackenzie and he extended his hand. "Gerald Calloway," he said, "I own this shop. I owe you an apology on behalf of my establishment. What you've done with this rifle is extraordinary work." Earl took the offered hand and shook it. "Earl Mackenzie, no apology needed on your behalf. Your young man here is doing fine." Gerald picked up the rifle with the hands of someone who had spent significant time around firearms and knew how to hold them, and he examined it. The action, the bore, running a bore light through it to check the interior. He looked at the trigger. He looked at the bolt face. He looked up at Earl with the specific expression of one craftsman recognizing the work of another. Not surprise, exactly, but a kind of rueful acknowledgement that the work was better than he would have expected from a shop with full equipment and 2 people, let alone from one man with hand tools in a home garage. "What are your plans for it?" Gerald asked, setting the rifle down carefully. "I'll do a proper historical identification," Earl said. "Contact some people who know the provenance research. It deserves to be understood. Where it came from, how it ended up in that garden. After that, I haven't decided." "If you'd consider it," Gerald said, "I'd like to display it here, with full credit to your restoration. This is the kind of work people should see, the kind of work that reminds you what's actually possible when someone takes the time and has the knowledge." Earl considered this for a moment. He looked at the rifle on the counter, this object that had come to him out of the earth, that had been written off and reclaimed, that had been told it was finished and had turned out not to be. He thought about the man or men who had carried it a century ago, who had been young once, who had been told things were impossible and had done them anyway, because that is what soldiers do. "We can talk about it," Earl said. Derek had been quiet through the exchange between Earl and Gerald. He was quiet now in the way of someone who is processing something significant, rearranging certain internal structures that had previously seemed settled. He looked at the rifle. He looked at Earl. "Could I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead," Earl said. "The spring? You said you called a supplier in Roanoke. How did you know he'd have it? How did you even know where to start?" Earl was quiet for a moment. He picked up the rifle from the counter one final time, holding it with the comfort of long familiarity, and he looked at it. "When I told you I was Army for 22 years, he said, "I wasn't telling you that as a credential. I was telling you because it explains why I didn't give up when the first person I showed it to told me to. When you spend enough time being responsible for something, truly responsible, in the way that matters, where there are real consequences if you fail, you stop accepting that things can't be fixed. You start asking what it would take, and then you find out." He set the rifle down. He looked at Derek, and it was not the look of a man who has won something or proved something, but the look of a man who wants something to be understood. "The rifle wasn't impossible. It was just harder than you were willing to go. Those aren't the same thing." Derek nodded slowly. He said nothing for a moment, and then he said something that cost him something, which is the price of saying things that matter. "I should have listened to you 3 days ago. I'm sorry I didn't." "Now you will," Earl said. "That's the point." Gerald walked Earl to the door when he left, the rifle wrapped again in its canvas tarp under Earl's arm, the late afternoon light spreading long and warm across the parking lot of Route 9. Gerald stood in the doorway of his shop and watched the old man load the rifle carefully into the back seat of his truck, close the door with the same deliberateness he applied to everything, walk around to the driver's side. Before he got in, he glanced back at the shop, and Gerald raised a hand, and Earl raised a hand, and then he drove away. Gerald stood for a moment after the truck had gone around the corner. 30 years of running this shop, 30 years of watching people come through the door with objects that told stories, objects brought by people who also told stories, if you were paying the right kind of attention. He went back inside. Derek was still at the counter, looking at the space where the rifle had been. "I almost didn't come back," Gerald said. Derek looked up. "What?" "After my injury, when I got out. I almost didn't get into any of this. I thought about going somewhere nobody knew anything about what I'd done, about who I used to be, and just starting clean. No connection to any of it." He paused. "But the things you've been trained to do, the things you've been responsible for, they follow you. Not as a burden, as a foundation. You build on them or you don't, but they don't go away." He looked at his nephew's son. "That man carried 22 years of serious, difficult, consequential work into your shop on Thursday. You handed it back to him in about 45 seconds. Derek was quiet. "He came back," Gerald said. "That's the thing. He could have just done the work, kept the rifle, never come back here. But he came back. Why do you think he did that?" Derek thought about it. Genuinely thought. The way you think when you're not performing thought but actually engaged in it. "Because he wanted to show me," he said finally. "Not to embarrass me, to teach me." "That's a man who spent his career making sure the people around him could do the work," Gerald said. "Old habit. never really goes away. 2 weeks later, the rifle was back at Calloway's. Not under the counter, not in the storage room. In a display case that Gerald had cleared and cleaned specifically for the purpose, with a small placard that Earl had written the text for and Gerald had printed and framed. The placard explained what the rifle was: a Lee Enfield No. 1 Mark III, confirmed through subsequent research to have been issued in 1916 and carried to France by a soldier whose identity the Historical Society was still working to determine. It explained how it had been found and how it had been restored. It credited Earl Mackenzie, former Army armourer, 22 years' service for the restoration. And at the bottom, in smaller text, it said something that Gerald had added himself, without consulting anyone, because he felt it needed to be said. The man who restored this rifle was told it was impossible. He chose not to believe that. People came in and read it. Some of them paused at the case for longer than they'd intended, looking at the rifle, cleaned and correct, the wood stock with its old crack nearly invisible, the steel showing the dark, honest tone of properly preserved old metal. And then they looked at the placard and read it again. A few of them asked about Earl, Gerald told them. Not everything, because everything is a long story, and most people standing in a gun shop on a Tuesday afternoon don't have the full measure of time that story deserves. But enough to convey what kind of man Earl Mackenzie was, and what kind of work he'd done for 22 years, and what had been said to him by someone who was too quick and too certain, and what he had done about it. Derek left Millbrook at the end of summer for his new job, as planned. But before he left, he asked Gerald if he could have the name of the parts supplier in Roanoke that Earl had mentioned. He asked if Earl would be willing to talk to him again sometime, by phone if not in person. Gerald passed the request to Earl, and Earl said yes, and that is how Derek spent several evenings over the following months on the phone with a 74-year-old former Army armourer in Millbrook, Virginia, getting an education that no formal gunsmithing program had seen fit to include in its curriculum. Not because it wasn't available, but because it was being carried around in the working memory of men like Earl who were getting older every year, and nobody had thought to ask them to share it before it was too late. The garden behind Earl's house produced well that fall. Tomatoes, turnips, the late beans that always came in better when the nights started cooling. He worked it in the mornings, in the quiet hour that belongs to gardeners and soldiers, moving slowly and deliberately between the rows, and if you passed on the sidewalk out front you would see just old Earl puttering around again. You would not see the 22 years. You would not see the hands that had once maintained the weapons of a nation, that had spent 4 hours on a trigger assembly while fighting their own tremor, that had refused to accept the word impossible from anyone, including their own diminished grip. You would not see any of that unless you stopped and looked, really looked, with the kind of attention that a certain old man from Millbrook would tell you was the beginning of all understanding. If this story reminds you that experience deserves respect, that the quiet people moving slowly around you carry histories worth knowing, subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories of the men and women who earned what they know, who refused to quit, and who sometimes, when a young person is finally ready to listen, find a way to pass it on.